200 Comanche warriors don't just show up at your doorstep by accident. They come for blood, for justice, or for war. And Samuel Bear McKenna was about to discover which one it was. But before we dive into this incredible true story of courage, conscience, and the power of a single act of kindness, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because the stories we share here will change how you see the world forever. Now let's go back to where it all began in the unforgiving plains of Texas 1885. When 200 Comanche warriors surrounded this cowboy's ranch, nobody expected what happened next. The nightmare always began the same way, with screams cutting through the morning air like broken glass, and Samuel Bear McKenna, frozen behind a cluster of mesquite trees, his rifle heavy and useless in his trembling hands. 2 years had passed since that morning, but the images remained crystal clear in his mind. He could still see the smoke rising from the Comanche camp, still hear the thunder of hooves as the raiders, white men, not soldiers, just desperate outlaws, swept down on the peaceful gathering like vultures. He remembered the woman in traditional dress frantically pushing a small girl toward the creek bed, remembered the moment their eyes met across the distance, hers filled with a mother's desperate love, his with the cowardice that would haunt him forever. Bear had raised his rifle that day, had aimed, had every opportunity to fire a warning shot, to create a distraction, to do something, anything, that might have changed the outcome. Instead, he had watched as the woman fell, watched as the little girl disappeared into the tall grass, watched as the raiders scattered, leaving death and silence in their wake. Now as the Texas sun beat down mercilessly on his ranch somewhere between Amarillo and the edge of nowhere, Bear tried to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of mending fence posts. The physical labor helped quiet the voices in his head, the ones that whispered coward with every heartbeat. At 34, he had built a life of deliberate isolation, surrounding himself with cattle and silence, hoping that distance might somehow ease the weight of his guilt. The ranch had been his sanctuary since losing his wife Emma and their son Thomas to cholera 3 years ago. Death, it seemed, had a particular fondness for taking away everything he loved while leaving him behind to remember. But this morning, as sweat dripped from his weathered face and his hands worked automatically to repair the broken wood, something felt different, wrong even. A movement near the creek caught his eye. Bear straightened slowly, his heart beginning to race for reasons he couldn't explain. There, stumbling across his property with the unsteady gait of someone pushed far beyond endurance, was a child. Small, thin, wearing traditional Native American clothing that hung in tatters from a frame so slight it seemed the next breeze might carry her away. The world tilted on its axis. Even from 50 yards away, even with 2 years of trying to forget, Bear recognized something in the way she moved, in the desperate angle of her shoulders. His rifle slipped from nerveless fingers, clattering against the fence post as memories crashed over him like a flood. It couldn't be. But as the child drew closer, stumbling toward his water source with the single-minded determination of someone dying of thirst, Bear saw the truth written in every line of her small body. This was the girl from the creek bed, the child whose mother had died while he watched from the safety of his cowardice. The girl, she couldn't be more than 8 or 9 now, spotted him standing motionless by the fence. Their eyes met, and Bear felt something shatter inside his chest. She was starving, dehydrated. Every step was a monumental effort, and yet there was something in her dark eyes that spoke of strength beyond her years. She stopped 20 feet away, swaying slightly on her feet. When she spoke, it was in rapid Comanche, her voice cracked and desperate. Bear didn't understand the words, but he understood the universal language of need written across her face. Her small hands gestured toward her mouth, then toward the creek, then toward him, with a pleading that transcended any cultural barriers. Most ranchers in these parts would reach for their rifle first and ask questions later. The thought came unbidden, along with the voices of his neighbors, the warnings he'd heard in town about rising tensions with the local tribes. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to send her away. Maybe give her some water and point her toward the reservation. Keep his distance. Protect himself. Instead, Bear found himself walking towards her, his hands visible, and his movements slow and deliberate. With each step, the weight of 2 years of guilt pressed down on him like a physical thing. This wasn't redemption. Nothing could bring back her mother or undo his cowardice. But maybe, just maybe, it was a chance to prove to himself that he wasn't entirely lost. The girl watched him approach with eyes too old for her face, too wise for someone who should have been playing with dolls instead of fighting for survival. When he knelt down in front of her, she didn't flee. Instead, she reached out with one trembling hand and touched the scar on his forearm, a mark left by a childhood accident with barbed wire. She spoke again, softer this time, and Bear caught one word he thought he understood: Washichu, white man. But the way she said it wasn't filled with hatred or fear. It was recognition. She remembers me. The realization hit him like lightning. Somehow impossibly, this child remembered the coward who had watched her mother die. And yet here she was, trusting him with her life. Bear scooped her up in his arms, surprised by how little she weighed, how fragile she felt against his chest. She didn't resist, was too weak to fight even if she'd wanted to. As he carried her toward his modest cabin, he could feel her small body trembling, whether from hunger, exhaustion, or the lingering trauma of everything she'd endured. Inside the cabin, Bear settled her gently on his only comfortable chair, the one Emma used to occupy while she mended clothes and hummed softly to Thomas. The parallel wasn't lost on him, and for a moment the grief threatened to overwhelm the guilt. But the girl's soft moan of exhaustion pulled him back to the present. He moved quickly to prepare food, ladling leftover stew from the pot that hung over his fireplace, cutting thick slices from the bread he'd baked that morning. The smell of the food seemed to revive her slightly, and for the first time since he'd found her, Bear saw something that might have been hope flicker in her eyes. As he handed her the bowl, Bear caught sight of something around her neck that made his blood run cold. Partially hidden by her torn clothing was a necklace of intricate beadwork, patterns he'd heard described in hushed, fearful tones in the saloons of nearby towns. The ceremonial jewelry worn by the family of Chief White Bull, the most powerful and feared Comanche leader in the region. Bear's hand froze halfway to adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. If this girl was who he thought she was, he wasn't just harboring a lost child. He was keeping the daughter of a man who could bring 200 warriors down on his head without breaking a sweat. A man who had every reason in the world to believe that any white man found with his missing daughter was a kidnapper deserving of the most brutal death the Comanche could devise. But it was too late to change course now. The girl was already eating with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't seen food in days, tears streaming down her face as she alternated between spoonfuls of stew and broken sobs. Bear couldn't bring himself to turn her away, couldn't bear the thought of adding to her suffering, even if helping her might cost him everything. What Bear didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that 20 miles away, a Comanche search party had just found the girl's trail leading directly toward his ranch. And at the head of that party rode Chief White Bull himself, his weathered face set in lines of grief and fury that promised nothing but death for whoever had taken his daughter. The girl, little star though Bear wouldn't learn her name for hours yet, finished eating and looked up at him with something that might have been gratitude. But as she spoke again in her native tongue, Bear caught the exhaustion in her voice, saw how her eyelids were already drooping with the weight of safety finally found. Within minutes, she was asleep in his chair, her small body finally able to surrender to the rest it so desperately needed. Bear covered her with his only blanket, the one Emma had sewn from scraps of fabric during their first winter together, and tried to convince himself that he'd done the right thing. But as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across his property, that conviction started to crumble. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made his stomach drop, and Bear peered through his window to see 3 riders approaching at a hard gallop: his neighbor Cletus Hartwell, Deputy Sheriff Jake Morrison, and the local preacher, Reverend Thomas. Bear stepped outside before they could dismount, hoping to keep their voices down and avoid waking the girl. But Cletus was already shouting before his horse came to a full stop. "Bear, you damned fool, what in the hell are you thinking?" Cletus's face was flushed with anger and something that looked suspiciously like fear. Deputy Morrison nodded grimly as he dismounted, his hand resting unconsciously on the butt of his pistol. "My father sent word from town," Morrison said, his voice tight with attention. "Chief White Bull's daughter went missing 3 days ago during a hunting expedition. Word is she wandered off during a storm and got lost." He paused, studying Bear's face carefully. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about a missing Comanche girl, would you, Bear?" The smart thing would have been to lie, to send them away and figure this out on his own, maybe try to get the girl back to her people under cover of darkness. But these men had been his neighbors for years, and despite their flaws, they were here out of genuine concern for his safety. "She's inside," Bear said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the wind, half-starved and exhausted. "I couldn't just leave her to die." The silence that followed was deafening. Reverend Thomas was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Son, do you have any idea what you've done?" "I helped a hungry child," Bear replied, but even as he said it, he could hear how naive it sounded in the face of the reality they were all contemplating. Cletus started pacing back and forth, running his hands through his graying hair. "They're going to think you took her, Bear." "Hell, they probably already think that. White bulls have been known to wipe out entire settlements for less than this." Deputy Morrison was already backing toward his horse. "I have to report this, Bear. It's my duty. But I'll give you a head start. Get her back to her people before they find you here." "In the dark," Bear asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "She can barely walk, and how am I supposed to approach a Comanche camp without getting filled full of arrows?" "That's your problem now," Morrison said, mounting his horse with practiced ease. "I'm riding to town to warn everyone else. If White Bull decides to make an example of you, he might not stop at just your ranch." As the three men rode away, their horses kicking up clouds of dust in the fading light, Bear stood alone in the growing darkness. From inside the cabin came the soft, even breathing of a child finally able to rest. He thought about saddling up and trying to find the Comanche camp, but he knew it would be suicide for both of them. He thought about loading her into his wagon and trying to reach the nearest town, but that would only make things worse. The truth was, there was no good way out of this. Every option led to the same place: a confrontation with one of the most feared war chiefs in Texas, a man who had every reason to believe the worst about Bear's intentions. As if summoned by his thoughts, a new sound drifted across the plains. The distant rhythm of war drums, growing closer with each passing beat. Bear's blood turned to ice. They weren't waiting for morning. The Comanche were coming tonight. Bear rushed back into the cabin, his mind racing. The war drums were getting louder, and he could now make out individual beats in the rhythm. Slow, methodical, and absolutely terrifying. This wasn't the chaotic noise of a raiding party. This was something far more organized and infinitely more dangerous. Little Star stirred in the chair, awakened by the sound that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the cabin. Her eyes opened wide, and for the first time since he'd found her, Bear saw not just recognition, but understanding cross her face. She knew what those drums meant, better than he did. She spoke rapidly in Comanche, pointing toward the door, and then at herself, her small hands moving in gestures that needed no translation. She was trying to tell him something important, something that might save both their lives, but the language barrier made communication almost impossible. Bear knelt down beside her chair, speaking as calmly as he could manage, despite the fear clawing at his throat. "I know you can't understand me, little one, but I'm trying to help you. Those drums, that's your people coming for you, isn't it?" Little Star nodded vigorously, then grabbed Bear's shirt with both hands and pulled him toward the window. She pointed outside and began holding up her fingers, counting in a way that made Bear's legs go weak. 10, 20, 30. She kept going until she'd indicated what looked like 200. 200 warriors. Bear had been hoping for maybe a dozen angry braves that he could somehow reason with, maybe convince of his good intentions. But 200, that was enough to level every ranch within 50 miles, enough to start a war that would consume the entire territory. The drums stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. Bear moved to the window and peered out into the darkness, at first seeing nothing but shadows and starlight. Then, like ghosts materializing from the night itself, he began to make out shapes moving across his property. They came in perfect formation, warriors on horseback, spread out in a wide semicircle that was slowly tightening around his cabin. Even in the moonlight, Bear could see the war paint on their faces, the feathers in their hair, the weapons gleaming in their hands. These weren't men who had come to negotiate. Little Star tugged on Bear's sleeve again, this time gesturing frantically toward herself and then toward the door. She wanted to go to them, but Bear couldn't tell if that would help or make everything infinitely worse. What if they thought he had hurt her? What if they didn't believe she'd come to him willingly? A single voice called out from the darkness, speaking English, with a heavy accent but perfect clarity. "White man, we know you have taken something that belongs to us. Send out the girl and perhaps you will live to see morning." Bear's mouth went dry. The voice carried absolute authority. This had to be Chief White Bull himself. Bear had heard stories about the man, how he'd united several tribes under his leadership, how he'd never lost a battle against the U.S. cavalry, how he showed no mercy to those who wronged his people. Bear stepped toward the door, but Little Star grabbed his arm with surprising strength for someone so small. She shook her head frantically and pointed to herself, then made a gesture across her throat. She was trying to warn him about something, but what? Then it hit him like a physical blow. The girl wasn't just the chief's daughter, she was Chief White Bull's only daughter. In Comanche culture, that made her invaluable, not just as family, but as the future of their bloodline. If anything had happened to her while in Bear's care, even if it wasn't his fault, White Bull would have no choice but to make an example of him that other settlers would never forget. Bear realized with growing horror that saving the girl's life might have been the easy part. Now he had to prove to 200 armed warriors that he'd saved her, not stolen her. And he had about 30 seconds to figure out how to do that before Chief White Bull lost his patience and turned Bear's ranch into a battlefield. The weight of 2 years' worth of guilt, the memory of a mother's dying eyes, the knowledge that this child represented his only chance at redemption. It all came crashing down on Bear as he stood in his doorway, staring into a night filled with the promise of violence. He made the hardest decision of his life. Bear opened the cabin door and stepped outside with his hands raised high, Little Star following close behind him, her small hand gripping the back of his shirt like a lifeline. The sight that greeted Bear was something straight out of his worst nightmares, made manifest. 200 Comanche warriors sat motionless on their horses, forming a perfect circle around his property that seemed to stretch into infinity. War paint gleamed like blood in the moonlight, and every weapon, lance, bow, tomahawk, was pointed directly at him with the precision of men who had never missed their mark. At the front of the formation sat a man who could only be Chief White Bull, massive and imposing with silver streaking through his long black hair, and eyes that seemed to burn with barely contained fury. He radiated the kind of authority that came from decades of leading men into battle and bringing them home alive. His horse, a magnificent paint stallion, stood perfectly still beneath him, as if even the animal understood the gravity of this moment. Little Star ran toward her father, calling out in rapid Comanche, her voice carrying across the silent night like a prayer. But instead of the joyful reunion Bear had expected, White Bull's expression grew even darker as his daughter reached him. The chief dismounted with fluid grace and knelt beside Little Star, examining her carefully while she spoke, her small hands gesturing frantically back toward Bear in the cabin. Bear couldn't understand the words, but he could read the chief's body language like a book written in violence. Every muscle in White Bull's frame was coiled like a spring, ready to explode, and whatever Little Star was telling him wasn't making things better. If anything, the war chief's rage seemed to be building with each word his daughter spoke. Finally, White Bull stood and walked toward Bear with slow, deliberate steps. The other warriors remained mounted, but shifted their weapons, the subtle movement creating a sound like rattlesnakes, preparing to strike. Bear had never felt so exposed, so utterly helpless, as he did standing there with his hands raised, while death approached him, one measured footfall at a time. "My daughter tells me you fed her again," White Bull said, when he stopped just outside arm's reach, his English precise and cold as winter steel. "She tells me you gave her shelter when she had none." "Yes," Bear replied, his voice steadier than he felt, though his heart was hammering so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. "She was starving. I couldn't let a child die." White Bull studied him for a long moment, and his dark eyes seeming to peer directly into Bear's soul. "She also tells me you saw the sacred beads of our family around her neck. You knew who she was, yet you did not immediately return her to us." Bear's heart sank. This was it. The moment everything went wrong, when good intentions collided with the harsh realities of a world divided by blood and mistrust. I was going to bring her back in the morning," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "She was too weak to travel at night." "Perhaps," White Bull said, his tone suggesting he didn't believe a word of it, "or perhaps you thought to keep her as a prize, to trade her back to us for cattle or horses or safe passage through our lands." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Bear could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on him, warriors waiting for their chief's signal to turn this conversation into a massacre that would echo through the territory for generations. But then something unexpected happened. Little Star, who had been standing silently beside her father, suddenly stepped forward and spoke again. Not to White Bull, but directly to Bear, her young voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Bear didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. She was defending him. This small girl, who had every reason to fear and hate white men, was standing up to 200 of her own people's greatest warriors to protect the man who had shown her kindness. White Bull's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his features as his daughter continued speaking. She pointed to Bear, then to herself, then mimed eating and sleeping. She was telling the story of her rescue, and even the warriors who had been grumbling for blood were listening now. She is telling them how you found her. White Bull translated, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been curiosity. How you could have sent her away, could have used her for your own purposes, but instead simply cared for her as you would your own child. Little Star wasn't finished. She continued speaking, her voice growing stronger and more passionate with each word, and Bear watched as something remarkable began to happen. The hard faces of the warriors around them started to soften, if only slightly. Whatever she was saying was having an impact. She is asking them? White Bull continued, his own voice growing quieter. What they would want a stranger to do if their child was lost and dying in the wilderness. She is asking them if punishing mercy makes us any better than the soldiers who kill without asking questions first. Bear felt a glimmer of hope, but it was immediately crushed when a new voice rang out from the circle of warriors, harsh, angry, and filled with the kind of hatred that had been festering for years. A younger warrior, his face painted in stark patterns of red and black, spurred his horse forward until he was level with White Bull. The challenge in his posture was unmistakable, and when he spoke, his words were like bullets fired into the night. White Bull's response was quiet but firm, carrying the unmistakable tone of a leader who had been questioned before and had no intention of backing down. But Bear could see the younger warrior, this had to be the broken arrow that Pete Morrison had mentioned in town, wasn't backing down either. Broken Arrow believes that any white man who touches a Comanche child for any reason must pay the price. White Bull explained, his eyes never leaving Bear's face. He thinks I am being weak by talking instead of fighting. The young warrior pointed his lance directly at Bear and shouted something that needed no translation. Other voices began to join his, and Bear realized he was witnessing something that could tear the tribe apart. A challenge to White Bull's authority that was as dangerous for the chief as it was for Bear. He says the old ways demand blood for blood. White Bull continued, his jaw tightening. He says that mercy toward our enemies is what has allowed them to push us from our lands, kill our buffalo, poison our streams. Bear watched in growing alarm as the carefully maintained discipline of the war party began to fracture. Some warriors moved their horses behind Broken Arrow, nodding their agreement with his words. Others remained loyal to their chief, but Bear could see the uncertainty in their faces. This was about more than just one white rancher's fate. This was about the future direction of the entire tribe. That's when Little Star did something that surprised everyone, including her father. She stepped between the two men, both towering above her small frame, and began speaking in a voice that carried far beyond her years. Her words were passionate, urgent, and they cut through the rising tension like sunlight through storm clouds. Broken Arrow's expression shifted from rage to confusion to something that might have been shame. White Bull looked down at his daughter with something approaching amazement, and even the most bloodthirsty warriors seemed to be reconsidering their position. She is reminding Broken Arrow of his own children. White Bull translated, his voice soft with wonder. She is asking him what he would want a stranger to do if his son or daughter was dying of hunger and thirst in the wilderness of enemy territory. Little Star continued speaking, her gaze moving from warrior to warrior, addressing each man individually as if she could see into their hearts and understand their fears. Bear didn't need translation to understand what was happening. This child was performing a miracle of diplomacy that seasoned negotiators couldn't have managed. She is telling them about the sadness she saw in your eyes. White Bull continued, his own voice growing thick with emotion. About the photograph in your cabin, about how she could tell that you understood loss because you had lost children too. Bear felt his throat constrict. Somehow this observant little girl had seen through to the core of his grief, had understood that his kindness toward her came from the same place as his pain over Thomas and Emma. Broken Arrow lowered his lance slowly, conflict warring across his painted features. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost its edge of fury, replaced by something more complex. Doubt, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. He says, White Bull translated carefully that perhaps his anger has made him forget that not all enemies are the same. He says that maybe the Spirit sent you to teach us something about the difference between justice and vengeance. The silence that followed was profound. 200 warriors sat motionless, processing words that challenged everything they had believed about the war between their peoples. Bear could feel the moment balancing on a knife's edge, could sense that the next word spoken would determine whether this night ended in bloodshed or something else entirely. White Bull looked at Bear for a long moment, then at his daughter, then back at Bear. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of a decision that would echo through both their people's histories. There is still a problem, he said, and Bear's fragile hope crumbled. My warriors cannot return empty-handed. They cannot tell their wives and children that we rode out to punish a crime and came back with nothing but words. Bear's blood turned cold. What are you saying? I am saying that even though you meant no harm, you have created a situation that demands resolution. My people expected justice tonight, and if they don't get it, White Bull gestured toward the restless warriors, some of whom were already voicing their displeasure at the extended negotiations. Some of my young men believe that mercy toward white men is what has led to our people being driven from our ancestral lands. Outside the circle, Bear could hear increasingly agitated voices. He didn't need translation to understand that patience was wearing thin, that the delicate balance Little Star had created was beginning to slip. There is only one way to satisfy both justice and honor, White Bull said, his eyes boring into Bear's. But it will require something from you that may be harder than dying. Bear's mouth went dry. What? You will come with us to our village. You will stand before the tribal council and tell them exactly what happened. You will submit yourself to their judgment, knowing that they have every right to demand your life for the fear and anguish your actions, however well-intentioned, have caused. The words hit Bear like physical blows. He thought about what would happen to his ranch, his cattle, his small piece of the world if he never returned. He thought about the very real possibility that he was being asked to ride to his own execution. But then he looked down at Little Star, who was watching him with those same desperate eyes that had started this whole ordeal. Only this time he realized she wasn't begging for his help. She was offering hers. And somehow that made all the difference. If I agree to this, Bear said slowly, what happens to my property, my animals? Pete Morrison has already agreed to look after your ranch, White Bull replied, and Bear realized with a start that the old man must have been watching from a distance, must have understood what was happening. He says it is what neighbors do for each other. Bear nodded, his throat tight with emotion he couldn't name. And if your council decides I deserve death, then you will die knowing you chose honor over safety, White Bull said simply. And your name will be remembered by both our peoples as a man who showed mercy when he could have shown cruelty. Bear looked around at the circle of warriors, at the faces painted for war, at the weapons that could end his life in an instant. Then he looked at Little Star, who had somehow found the courage to stand up to 200 of the fiercest fighters on the Great Plains to defend a man who was by all rights supposed to be her enemy. I'll go, he said. The words seemed to surprise even White Bull, who studied Bear's face as if looking for signs of deception or fear. You understand what you are agreeing to, the chief asked. I understand that this little girl showed more courage in one night than I've shown in my entire life, Bear replied. I understand that she risked everything to defend me, and the least I can do is show the same courage she's shown. White Bull was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. We ride at dawn. As the warriors began to disperse, setting up a camp that would surround Bear's property until morning, Little Star approached him one final time. She spoke in broken English, her words carefully chosen and pronounced with great difficulty. Thank you, she said, her small hand reaching out to touch the scar on his arm again. For saving me. Now I save you. Bear knelt down to her level, seeing in her young face a strength and wisdom that humbled him completely. You already have Little Star, he whispered, though he knew she wouldn't understand the words. You already have. Word count approximately 500 words. Part 3, the Council of Forgiveness. 6,000 words. The ride to the Comanche village took 4 hours through terrain that Bear had never imagined existed. Hidden canyons carved by ancient waters, secret paths that wound between towering rock formations, and valleys so remote they seemed untouched by the outside world. As they traveled deeper into what the white settlers called hostile territory, Bear began to understand that his people had never really comprehended the true scope and majesty of the land they were trying to claim. Chief White Bull rode beside him, occasionally pointing out landmarks or explaining the significance of certain places, not as a captor indulging his prisoner, but as one man sharing his world with another who had shown kindness to his child. Little Star rode behind her father, chattering occasionally in Comanche and sometimes attempting English phrases that made Bear smile despite his apprehension about what lay ahead. As they crested a final ridge, the village spread out below them like something from a dream. Dozens of teepees arranged in careful patterns cook fires, sending ribbons of smoke into the pre-dawn air, and people moving about their morning routines with the easy rhythm of a community that had found its place in the world. Bear had expected something primitive, savage, even based on the stories he'd heard in town. Instead, he saw organization, beauty, and a deep harmony between the people and their environment. Word of their arrival had preceded them. By the time they reached the village center, a crowd had gathered, men, women, and children all staring at the white man who had somehow convinced Chief White Bull to spare his life. Bear felt their eyes on him, reading everything from curiosity to hostility in their expressions, but also something he hadn't expected: restraint. These people could have torn him apart with their bare hands, but they held back, waiting for their leaders to decide his fate. The tribal council convened immediately in a large lodge at the heart of the village. 7 elders sat in a semicircle around a central fire, their weathered faces grave in the dancing shadows. Bear stood in the center, acutely aware that he was probably the first white man to enter this sacred space and live to tell about it. The eldest of the council members, a man whose hair had gone completely white with age, spoke first. His voice was like wind through canyon walls, ancient, patient, and carrying the weight of decades of wisdom. White Bull translated his words. Running Eagle asks why we have brought a white man into our sacred council lodge, instead of leaving his bones for the vultures as our enemies have done to our people. Bear felt his knees weaken, but he forced himself to remain standing. Little Star, who had been granted permission to attend despite her age, spoke up before her father could continue the translation. Her words were calm and measured, but they carried the absolute conviction of someone who had seen truth and would not be swayed from it. She spoke for nearly 10 minutes, never once looking away from the elders' faces, her young voice filling the lodge with a passion that needed no translation. When she finished, another council member, a woman whose scars spoke of battles fought and survived, asked her a single question. Little Star's response was immediate and unwavering, her chin raised with defiance that would have done credit to any warrior. She asked Little Star if she truly believes you would risk your life to save a Comanche's child again, knowing what it might cost you. White Bull translated, his voice soft with something that might have been pride. My daughter said yes, without hesitation. The elders conferred among themselves in whispers that seemed to go on forever. Bear's heart pounded as he waited for their decision, knowing that these next few moments would determine whether he lived or died. The fire crackled and popped in the silence, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across faces that had seen more of life's cruelties than any people should have to endure. Finally, Running Eagle stood slowly, his joints creaking with age. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of decades of leadership, and Bear hung on every word that White Bull translated. He says that the spirits have sent us a test tonight, not a test of our ability to make war, but our ability to recognize when mercy deserves mercy in return. Bear felt his legs go weak with relief, but Running Eagle wasn't finished. The old man continued speaking, his eyes never leaving Bear's face. You will be granted safe passage back to your land, White Bull continued. But more than that, you will be granted the protection of our tribe. Any Comanche who harms you or your property will answer to this council. Bear could barely speak. I don't know what to say. There is one condition, Running Eagle continued through White Bull's translation. You must promise that if any of our people come to you in need, hungry, wounded, or lost, you will show them the same kindness you showed this child. I promise, Bear said without hesitation, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. What happened next surprised everyone in the lodge. Little Star ran to Bear and hugged him tightly, speaking in a mixture of Comanche and broken English that made several of the elders smile despite the gravity of the moment. She says, White Bull translated his own voice thick with emotion, that you saved her life when you could have taken it, and now she hopes she has saved yours when others would have taken it. But even as relief flooded through Bear's system, he knew there was still one more thing he needed to do. Something that had been eating at him since the moment he'd recognized Little Star stumbling across his property. Chief White Bull, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. There's something else. Something I need to tell you before I can accept your forgiveness. The lodge fell silent. White Bull's expression grew wary, and Bear could see some of the elders shifting uncomfortably. Little Star looked up at him with wide eyes, perhaps sensing that whatever he was about to say would change everything. Bear took a shaking breath, knowing that the words he was about to speak might undo everything Little Star had accomplished, might turn mercy back into vengeance in the space of a heartbeat. 2 years ago, I was hunting near Willow Creek when I heard gunshots. He began, his voice growing stronger as he forced himself to meet White Bull's eyes. I saw raiders, white men outlaws, attacking a small group of your people. There was a woman with a chara. White Bull's face went completely still, but Bear could see understanding beginning to dawn in his dark eyes. Little Star pressed closer to Bear's side, her small hand gripping his shirt as if she could somehow hold him together through what was coming. I had a rifle. I had a clear shot. I could have warned you, could have created a distraction, could have done something, anything to help. Bear's voice cracked, 2 years of guilt, finally finding its voice. Instead, I watched. I watched your wife die, Chief, and I did nothing to stop it. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Bear could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the crackling of the fire, could hear Little Star's sharp intake of breath as she realized what he was confessing. White Bull rose slowly to his feet, and for a moment Bear was certain his life was about to end. The chief's hand moved to the knife at his belt, and several of the elders leaned forward, their faces hard with renewed anger. But then Little Star did something extraordinary. She stepped between Bear and her father, her small body shaking, but her voice clear and strong as she spoke in rapid Comanche. Whatever she said made White Bull freeze, his hands still on his weapon, but his eyes fixed on his daughter's face. She remembers, White Bull said quietly, his voice hollow with old pain. She remembers seeing you in the trees that day. She remembers thinking that maybe you would help. Bear felt like he was drowning in shame. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I've lived with that cowardice every day since, and when I found her on my land, I knew. I knew it was my chance to finally do what I should have done that day. White Bull looked at Bear for a long moment, then at his daughter, then back at Bear. When he spoke again, his words were measured, careful, as if he were walking across thin ice. Do you know why I didn't attack your ranch immediately when we found Little Star's trail leading to your property? Bear shook his head, not trusting his voice. Because she told me about a man in the trees, a white man who could have taken her that day when she was hiding in the creek bed, frightened and alone after watching her mother die. A man who instead rode away and left her to find her own way back to us. White Bull's eyes bored into Bear's soul. She has wondered for 2 years whether that man was a coward or an angel. Tonight she has her answer. Well, Bear felt tears burning his eyes. I was a coward. I am a coward. No, Little Star said suddenly, her English halting but clear. Not coward. Scared man who learned to be brave. White Bull knelt down beside his daughter, and for the first time since Bear had met him, the war chief's face softened completely. He spoke to Little Star in gentle Comanche, and she responded with the same mixture of wisdom and innocence that had saved Bear's life once already. She says, White Bull translated, rising to face Bear again, that her mother told her once that the spirits sometimes use our greatest failures to teach us how to achieve our greatest victories. She believes that your failure to save her mother led directly to your success in saving her. Running Eagle, who had been listening to this exchange with the patience of someone who had seen many such moments of truth, spoke again. His words were longer, this time more complex, and White Bull took several moments to translate them. He says that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to do what it is right despite that fear. He says that a man who feels no fear has nothing to overcome, but a man who feels great fear and acts anyway, that man has achieved something sacred. Bear could barely process what he was hearing. After 2 years of carrying the weight of his cowardice, after expecting to die for his failures, he was instead being offered something he had never dreamed possible understanding. There is more, White Bull continued, and Bear braced himself for whatever was coming next. The council has decided that you will not simply be granted protection. You will be adopted into our tribe as an honorary member. You will be given a Comanche name, and you will serve as a bridge between our peoples. Bear's legs finally gave out, and he sank to his knees in the dirt of the lodge floor. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve any of this kindness. That, said Running Eagle through White Bull's translation, is exactly why you do deserve it. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Bear could have imagined. He was given the name Tsina Vo, one who learns to see, and marked with symbols that indicated his status as a protected member of the tribe. Little Star, beaming with pride, helped paint the designs on his face while explaining in her mixture of languages what each symbol meant. As dawn broke over the Comanche village, Bear found himself sitting beside White Bull, outside the chief's teepee, watching the daily routines of a people he had been taught to fear and hate. Children played games in the dusty spaces between lodges. Women prepared food and mended clothing. Men worked on weapons and tools with the easy competence of lifelong craftsmen. It's not what I expected, Bear admitted. What did you expect? White Bull asked. I don't know. Savagery, I suppose. Chaos. The stories we tell in town are probably the same stories we tell about you, White Bull observed with something that might have been amusement, about how white men live in wooden boxes and poison the earth and steal children in the night. Bear felt heat rise in his cheeks. Some of those stories are probably true. And some of the stories about us are probably true as well, White Bull replied. The difference is that now you know they are not the whole truth. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Little Star play with other children her age, her laughter carrying across the village like music. She seemed so normal, so carefree, that it was hard to believe she had been near death just 2 days before. What happens now? Bear asked. Now you go home, White Bull said simply. You tend your cattle and mend your fences and live your life. But when travelers come to your door, whether they are white or Comanche or Mexican or anything else, you will remember this night. You will remember that mercy given freely is mercy that returns sevenfold. And if there's trouble between our peoples again, then you will be one of the few men alive who can speak truth to both sides, White Bull replied. One of the few who has seen that our children laugh the same way that our old people carry the same wisdom, that our hearts break with the same sound. Bear nodded, understanding beginning to dawn. This wasn't just about his personal redemption. He was being given a role to play in something much larger than himself. The journey back to Bear's ranch was accompanied by an honor guard rather than captors. White Bull himself rode alongside Bear, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing stories about the history of the land they were crossing. Little Star chattered happily in both languages, clearly delighted to be serving as translator between the two men who had become in their own way friends. When they finally reached Bear's property, Pete Morrison was waiting for them, his weathered face creased with worry that transformed into amazement when he saw Bear riding freely among the Comanche warriors. Well, I'll be damned, the old man breathed as they dismounted. I never thought I'd see you alive again, Bear. Makes two of us, Bear replied with a shaky laugh. White Bull clasped Bear's shoulder in a gesture that somehow conveyed more respect than any medal or commendation ever could. Remember your promise, he said simply. Every day, Bear assured him. Little Star hugged Bear one final time, whispering something in Comanche that made her father smile. She says you will always be her second father, White Bull translated. The one who taught her that enemies can become family if we are brave enough to see past our fears. As the Comanche party prepared to leave, Bear felt a profound sense of loss. These people who should have been his enemies had become in the space of a single night something precious to him. Will I see you again, he asked. When the seasons change and the trading paths are safe, Little Star will visit, White Bull promised. She has decided that you need to learn proper Comanche, and she has appointed herself your teacher. Bear laughed, the sound carrying a joy he hadn't felt since before Emma and Thomas died. I look forward to it. Over the months and years that followed, Bear's ranch became something unprecedented in the Texas territory. a neutral ground where Comanche and white settlers could meet safely. He never got rich, never became famous, but he lived the rest of his life knowing that sometimes the smallest acts of mercy can prevent the greatest tragedies. True to her word, Little Star visited regularly, bringing news from the village and patiently teaching Bear her language. She grew into a remarkable young woman who served as translator and peacekeeper between the tribes and settlers, carrying forward the lessons she had learned from a coward who found the courage to choose compassion over fear. Bear lived to be 73, dying peacefully in his sleep. It's surrounded by friends from both cultures who had learned that courage isn't always about fighting. Sometimes it's about knowing when to feed a hungry child instead of reaching for a gun. On the day of his funeral, representatives from 5 different Comanche bands rode openly through the town to pay their respects to the white man who had shown them that not all enemies had to remain enemies forever. Little Star, now a mother herself, spoke at his grave in both languages, telling the gathered crowd about the night when 200 warriors had surrounded a ranch expecting to find an enemy and instead discovered a bridge between two worlds. He taught us, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled mourners, that the bravest thing any of us can do is choose love over fear, mercy over revenge, understanding over hatred. He showed us that heroes are not those who never feel afraid, but those who act with kindness despite their fear. As the sun set over the Texas plains, casting long shadows across a land that had seen too much violence and not nearly enough understanding, Bear's legacy lived on in the lives he had touched and the peace he had helped create. His ranch continued to serve as neutral ground, tended now by Little Star's eldest son, who had inherited both his grandmother's wisdom and his honorary grandfather's compassion. And sometimes when the wind was just right and the light fell at the perfect angle, travelers would swear they could still see the ghost of Samuel Tsinavo McKenna standing by his fence post with his hands raised in greeting, ready to offer food and shelter to anyone in need, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke. Because in the end, that's what courage really looks like. Not the absence of fear, but the choice to do what's right despite that fear. Not the power to destroy, but the wisdom to build bridges where others see only walls. And in a world that seemed determined to divide itself along every possible line, that was a lesson worth remembering.